The Open Therapy Institute is addressing bias in mental health care. Go to our website, opentherapyinstitute.org. We have CE credit workshops about overlooked issues in the field. You can go to our workshop page and register now and become a member. And for those looking for a therapist, we match people with someone who's highly skilled and truly open. Just contact us through the contact page on the website or email us at info@opentherapyinstitute.org. Hi, I'm Leslie Elliott Boyce, and I'm speaking with Andrew Hartz of the Open Therapy Institute. And Andrew, I think this is our 17th episode of this podcast series. It's been a really interesting journey into lots of different topics. And today you wanted to talk about the potential harmful effects of DEI trainings, which I think is such an important thing to address because these are going on in all kinds of industries, all kinds of fields in education, and they're really concerning to a lot of people, really alienating, and so much is coming up for people around this new wave of I guess ideological training that has seemed to have just crept up over the last decade, 5 years. So
Well, it's interesting because there were kind of like proto social justice things that I had to do in the past, and sometimes those could get really weird. My sense is that they're sustained largely by the fact that people are afraid to challenge aggression and false claims in these workshops because if they do that, they'll get attacked as racist or sexist and viciously attacked um, often with really severe social and professional consequences. So they lean hard on the overuse of those accusations in order to sustain ideologies that I suspect a lot of people find problems with. Um, Another thing to think about, which we're not really talking about today, but I think that because there's such a implicit threat behind the trainings of disagreement will lead to your destruction. Uh,
mm,
that it's not just self-censorship that it's a problem, but people will actually repress thoughts and feelings that disagree with these ideologies so that they're unconscious.
mm,
And they convince themselves to agree because even acknowledging those thoughts and feelings is a threat. So a lot of it is self-censorship, but there's also even beyond self-censorship, there's repression
mm.
of observations that you'd think anybody paying attention would have. My I wrote an article like this for OTIs and report on issues that are overlooked in mental health because of bias. And we have our first edition of that. The first 10 articles in the intro will be coming out in early February, and including this one. So people will be able to see it there, and maybe we'll modify it for a piece that could go in the media. Although the current form is pretty, it's accessible, but it's pretty systematic and kind of in tone. It's not an op-ed. Um, wanted to talk about it today, the issues with DEI trainings, because a really great article came out um, recently by Lee Jussum and Pamela Paresky about the costs of DEI trainings. And they actually did an empirical study that showed, among other things, an increase in what they're called hostile attribution bias,
Mhm.
that DEI trainings will have certain target groups that are labeled as privileged oppressors, and they really teach people to see those groups as having hostility uh, or being having malicious intent, even for really mundane behaviors, and they kind of coach participants to view those groups as aggressors. Um, that was one of the key findings.
Mm.
One of the things that's really surprising too, and then we can get into my article, but one of the things that's really surprising about their study is how little people promoting DEI trainings are actually doing randomized control trials and studies to show that their interventions actually have a positive effect in the real world. And they don't seem to even think that they need evidence behind the claims and practices that they're engaging in. And there's lots of reasons to suspect that what they're teaching is actively destructive and harmful to people. Which is what my article's about. But it's like they don't even seem to feel the need to prove that this is helping people get along, that this is improving well-being, that this is improving efficiency or any outcomes. And there doesn't seem to be a robust evidence base for any of those claims. And as this recent study shows, there's lots of reasons to suspect that they're causing really countless negative, harmful dynamics. So that's what my article's about.
Yeah. I'd like to get into that and hear more about that, but that's one of the things that really when I think back to my own experience with this, when you talk about proto DEI trainings, I think about
Yeah.
there were like sexual harassment trainings that started coming out in the
Mm,
workplace where people had to watch a video. I can remember that being something that was as far back as probably my first jobs. You'd sometimes have to watch some video on sexual harassment in the workplace, like basically saying some of these behaviors aren't appropriate. Okay, you understand that, right? And so you've watched the video, they can check the box. So maybe some element of this has been there for quite a while, but it when in my own experience, the DEI training that I received was a class in a graduate program. When I was in my counseling program, I didn't recognize it as a DEI training. I thought it was just a course that I was taking in my program. But
right.
after getting a greater sense of what's going on culturally and with this sort of this socio-political phenomenon that's occurring, this DEI thing that's happening in universities and corporations, et cetera, I now see that as a DEI training. And it stood out because of, in that program, it really stood out in part because of that lack of an evidence base. Everything else that we were presented as graduate students was very carefully explained. This is why this is important. This is why we study psychology in this way. These are the people who came up with these concepts, and this is how
Right.
they proved their concepts to be important. There's a lot of that when you're studying social sciences. And in this case, you just have a professor standing up and saying, so let's talk about white privilege. Well, let's talk about
Right. Right.
um, white women's tears and white saviorism. And, there's no sort of, these are the founding thinkers that brought this philosophy to us. And this is why this is important. And this is how this is helpful to you and your clients. So that is, I'm glad you brought that up. I'm glad that they are addressing that. The lack of an evidence base is really apparent with this stuff.
Yeah, and it's striking that there's that they don't even seem to necessarily be pursuing it. I I really disagree with the way most critiques of these programs are framed.
Mm.
Um, and it actually is something that really bothers me. A lot of people will criticize DEI and they'll say it's a waste of money, or its resources could be better spent on other things, or they're divisive.
Mm.
I hate all three of those critiques because, and I think they're true. But the issue that's central to why these trainings are a problem is because they are hateful, hateful, hateful. And it's like the aggression is the issue. There
Mm.
are certain groups that are demonized and insulted, and
Mm.
there's other groups that are idealized. And there is a cruelty. And even it's not hard. I've been to plenty of trainings where the sadism of the facilitator is palpable. So to kind of say, well, that's a waste of money. I mean, obviously, I think it is a waste of money, but talk about missing the ball.
Mhm.
These are hateful, destructive, immoral things. And I
Mhm.
think that I remember seeing on social media somebody's profile, they said they listed themselves, they were kind of describing about themselves, and one of the things that they said was like, something like, please care about social justice or something. I can't remember how they, but it was like, I, I, I think that's the way that a lot of people who support DEI think about it. The good people care enough to do DEI, and the critics are preoccupied with not wasting money or not being divisive because that's going to ruffle feathers.
Mm,
And I view it the opposite way. I oppose DEI because I care, because I think it's immoral and hateful. It's all about caring about people and wanting to help people get along, which is why I oppose DEI. If it cost more money to get rid of DEI, I'd support paying that money. It's like
hmm
it's that destructive. And it's like it's and it doesn't I I don't the evidence isn't there that it's helping anyone to go around and insult white people. But let me go into um a couple of the I had six things. Obviously, hostile attribution bias was in this recent paper, which we should link to. But I had six other things. The one that I'm most concerned about is the all or nothing thinking and the lack of dialectical thinking in these trainings. And it really occurs in two distinct ways. One is you'll never hear an alternate viewpoint. The viewpoint in favor of all the ideas presented, white fragility, toxic whiteness, white privilege, whatever it is, white tears, whatever, white rage, they use all of this language. There's never a discussion of an alternative viewpoint. It's
hmm
all, or their side is obviously good, true, and, virtuous. And there's not even a reason to mention that it's possible to disagree with this because it's inconceivable. That's pretty standard. The other way that the all or nothing thinking plays a role is in the all or nothing framing of demographic groups. And this could be with race or gender, where there are certain groups where you only say bad things about them, white people and men, basically.
hmm
And then there's other groups that you only say good things about.
hmm
And and the good groups get praised and celebrated, and they're strong, noble, righteous, and beautiful, and the bad groups are sinful, fragile, ignorant, narcissistic, and toxic. And the good groups need to be praised and celebrated. The bad groups need to be dismantled and abolished and discriminated against. And that all or nothing framing of groups is so central to everything else that happens in these trainings. If there was a little bit of maybe there's one thing that's positive about one cultural dynamic in European cultures that has value, give one or two. Maybe there's one or two negative things in another group. And maybe, and not just to say, well, the anything positive about white people is a result of them being racist oppressors, and anything that's negative in other groups is just a result of white people being racist. It's actually talking about the groups as having positive and negative trends that are each related to them, and not just attributing everything bad to white people and everything good to the other groups. If they couldn't do that, I think the rest of the stuff in the trainings would be harder to sustain. The second one, and then I'll pause before getting to the next four. The second one that I'm most concerned about is what I said at the beginning, which is the aggression.
hmm
And, white tears, white rage, they're short phrases that pack a ton of hostility in them.
hmm
The comment of white rage, it's like it basically says that if white people are angry about anything, it's invalid because they're narcissistic and privileged and dumb and immoral. You communicate a lot in two words. White tears says white people's empathy is worthless and narcissistic, and it's so invalidating. And there's such a cruelty and a hatred that's obvious within those
hmm
insults. I Toxic whiteness, white narcissism, whiteness is parasitic condition. That there are so many examples of a normalized demonization of white people that has an obvious malicious sadistic quality to it.
hmm
And
hmm
I think I would say institutions that enable this to happen without doing anything about it, or if they fund it, or if it's like they should not underestimate how much the presence of one talk like this is going to discredit their institution, and how much the trust and the support for institutions is just wiped out when you allow that type of aggression to happen. It's obviously immoral, it's destructive, it doesn't help anyone, it's ignorant, it doesn't improve anything. I mean, and it's just cruelty and it's hateful. I I'll say one other thing and then I'll pause, but it's another term that another concept that I've grown to dislike is the idea of virtue signaling.
Mm.
And the reason why I don't like it is when I think of what virtue signaling is, I would think of somebody who gives a lot of money to children's cancer research and then brags about it. They're doing something virtuous for self-gain.
Mhm.
I don't know that that's the worst thing in the world. If you're really doing something virtuous, it's like, yes, it's in poor taste to brag about it, but you're really doing something good, and that's good too. So I have mixed feelings about that. When people were talking about virtue signaling, they were often referring to anti-white racial aggression or anti-male aggression. And these aren't virtuous behaviors. They were some of the most disgusting, ignorant, and immoral behaviors people can engage in, which is just bald-faced bigotry and hostility.
Mhm.
And they were doing it to aggrandize themselves, but there wasn't any virtue in what
Mhm.
was being advocated for. It wasn't nice, it wasn't constructive, it wasn't smart, it wasn't insightful, it wasn't accurate. And I think it just that's what kind of bothered me about the virtue signaling concept. If you're doing something that's genuinely good and you want to brag about it, that to me sounds like virtue signaling. I have mixed feelings about it. On the other hand, insulting people for their race and advocating that they get abolished and destroyed, I mean, that's how is that virtue signaling? That's just disgusting behavior for self-gain, and I don't think there's the slightest bit of virtue in it.
It's allegiance signaling more than anything. It's allegiance to this particular socio-political group. And the anti-racism is it's sort of like the excuse for the cruelty and the sadism in in order to be virtuous in this anti-racist way. This is like, I'm willing to sacrifice all of these people for this thing. So it's our
Yes.
virtue is destroying this other group in order to lift up this group because they're so wounded that this is the only way to help them is by putting all these other people down. So it's a very strange perversion of a virtue.
Well, they're becoming exactly like what they claim to be
Exactly.
against.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and there is this, I think we might have talked about this in other podcasts, but there is this double meaning of the word justice. The social justice is a term worth reflecting on, and justice has two pretty distinct connotations. One of them is like Plato's ideal of justice, that it's about balance and fairness.
Mhm.
And the other idea is I'm getting justice on you.
Mhm.
And when you go out and you get justice on them, you kill them and you
Mhm.
torture them. And there is this vindictive, it's his mask for sadism. It's
Vengeful. Yeah.
I feel wrong, so I can do whatever I want to you, and that's
Mhm.
justice. And people commit the worst atrocities in humanity in that false sense of justice.
Yeah.
And it's obvious that that's what social justice has become as a movement, um, is become a hate movement, and a sadistic, immoral hate movement. And I think you most palpably so not to just fixate on the aggression, but the all or nothing thinking and the
Mhm.
aggression are the two biggest problems with these
Yeah,
trainings.
the all or nothing thinking, when you're talking about that, I like the way that you framed that. There's no, they don't give any value to any counter positions. In fact, the counter positions are rolled into their their thinking in the first place. So if a white person objects to this, it's because they are flawed because of their whiteness. So you're fragile, and that's why you're having an objection. And if a person of color objects to this, it's because white supremacy has really
Right,
extra
right.
victimized you, and that's why you would dare to speak back against this because you're an internalized white supremacist. The funny one was when they called Larry Elder the blackface of white supremacy. They're
Right, right,
using,
right.
you'd hear that like you're an Uncle Tom if you don't agree with this. There's something wrong with you if you would dare to have a counter argument to any of these teachings.
Well, there's certain groups that are always valid no matter what, and you don't even need data. And then there's other people, no matter what they say, it's invalid no matter what, and they don't
Mhm.
need data. Um, there's certain groups that get empathy no matter what. You have to empathize with them. There's other groups that you can't empathize with, and if you express empathy towards those groups, it's immoral. And certain groups you have to help, certain groups you can't help. Certain groups you have to praise, certain
Mhm.
groups you can't praise, certain groups you can be aggressive towards, other groups you can't even have the faintest hint of bias against. It is the all or nothing framing of
Mhm.
these groups is so central to
Mhm.
these ideologies that you treat people based on their immutable characteristics in opposite all or nothing terms.
Mhm.
Um, and that's just so foundational, and it feeds into the aggression.
Well, the
You know,
aggression, I wanted to respond to something you said about that when the white tears thing, this was brought up in my counseling program by
right,
a woman with a PhD in psychology who was leading our class. And she said,
right,
"Did you hear the one about white women's tears?" And she brought it up very casually to us. And she said, "White women have their feelings and their crying has been overvalued. And so you
right,
have to keep that in mind. It's been a socially overvalued thing. There's been too much power in white women's tears. And
right,
so we're supposed to look at our clients through this lens of basically, she was asking us to jade ourselves a little bit to the feelings of this specific demographic. So I remember just being so appalled by this. Like, what if you're telling me that if a white woman comes in to my office and she's crying because she's got problems with her relationship with her husband because her father died, because she's struggling, whatever million reasons a person might feel moved to tears. I'm supposed to set the record straight on behalf of some other group not present in this office right now. And I'm supposed to see her feelings as less valid and less valuable. And so that aggression and that hostility that you're talking about, I thought of, it really made me think of Rwanda. It made me think of
right,
the,
right, right.
turning the Hutus and the Tutsis against each other. Like, we're going to tell you that there are some people that are not worthy of our empathy.
Yes, yes. Yeah, and there's a slickness to it all. What it makes me think of a little bit more is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest
Mhm.
and Nurse Ratched. And Nurse Ratched is um, full of aggression, but it's all masked in a certain type of professionalism that's good
Mhm.
for the whole.
Mhm.
And that personality structure is very common. Now, some people, I definitely have had people teach about social justice topics who were just unhinged, hateful bigots. But there's a lot that have this mask
Mhm.
of this is for the good of the whole, and that's why we need to separate you over here, and you need to recognize that you're this. It's like there's something really
Bureaucratic sadism.
it's bureaucratic. Yeah, that's a great turn of phrase. But yeah, there is, but it's I just there's this shyness that people clearly have about just naming the aggression, and I don't quite get it. I don't know if they're just afraid that if they talk candidly about the aggression, what's going to happen. But there's this tendency to say, well, they're inefficient. It's like, or something. It's like they're a waste of resources, or they'll want to focus on something else, like meritocracy,
Mhm.
uh, f free speech issues. Again, really important. Those are really important things. And I'm not saying that they're not true, but I just feel like the central thing here is the aggression. And I just don't know why people have such a hard time naming it and
Hmm.
saying that's the central thing. It's they would there's a sense that sometimes people have that if I take a more moderate position, that'll be more persuasive because it's less adversarial.
Hmm.
And so I'll take a more moderate position and that'll be more persuasive. The reason why that doesn't work here is because you're not actually saying what the actual problem is.
Hmm.
Say it in a nice way. You don't need to be unhinged. You don't need to hate anybody. You shouldn't hate anybody. That's not going to be effective. There's no reason to. Don't demonize other people. Don't, there's no reason to do any of that. Be nice, be thoughtful, be charitable, be humble. But you got to say what the issue is. And
Hmm.
I just don't, but there's this block where
What do you think that is? What do you think keeps people? Is it a lack of being able to actually recognize that?
I can't imagine that they're not seeing it. Maybe they're not formulating it clearly.
Well, you know
Maybe
what
they,
it makes me think of is like the casual sadism that you see so often in the medical field.
hmm,
Do you know what I'm talking about? Like the nurse
no.
or the lady at the desk will just like just do that little, when you mention Nurse Ratchet, that's what, because it's like they're just, and I worked in the medical field for over a decade,
Right.
and it's
Yeah.
just so you see these people who kind of get a little jaded towards the neediness of the people who are coming to them and
Yeah.
do a little bit to just grind their gears a little and sort of not respond in the compassionate way to the person in front of them. So there's this like it's very casual and it's very deniable. There's
Yes.
lots of plausible deniability. Oh, I don't know what you're talking about. But yeah, you did just take advantage of the opportunity to sort of push me back a little bit. You see it all the time in some fields. You see it in like the administrator, it's classic like secretary at the school office behavior
Right.
where she just will, and the DMV, all of these places where you see this very casually sadistic, not very aggressive or hostile, always with plausible deniability. And I just wonder
Right.
if that's
Right.
kind of the same beast that you're talking about, but just being employed through this DEI, which is much more
Yeah.
directly hostile rhetoric.
There might be a way that people are being culturally conditioned to expect and be normal. Like there is a way that racial aggression directed at white people has been culturally normalized over the
Right.
past 10 years. But a big reason why it's become normalized is because nobody says this is a problem.
Hmm.
I don't know of, and there probably is one or two, but I don't know of any national organization that acknowledges anti-white racial aggression or
Hmm.
anti-male aggression as a legitimate social issue and
Hmm.
focuses on it. Um, it would be great to have a racially and ethnically diverse, politically moderate, nice, non-hateful organization that says these are forms of hatred too, and
Hmm.
we should confront them in a loving, forgiving, open-minded way. I don't know, they needed him 10 years ago. I
Hmm.
don't know what the delay is. I don't know why people can't do it. Maybe they're struggling to find the tone. I think some people get so angry about it, they shut down, or they
Hmm.
become extremists, or they internalize it, or they repress it. It might be kind of like an emotion regulation thing, and they need help kind of getting a model of like, look, I don't hate people of other races. I think hatred towards every group is wrong. I would stand up against hatred towards every group. The only group that it's forbidden to care about hatred towards is white people, and I guess also men. And there's some of this
Hmm.
too, where anti-Christian hatred and increasingly anti-Semitism are also being normalized in different ways, and those matter too. Um, so I might include those, but I think the race and gender piece are really central.
Hmm.
One reason that's very important about why this has been normalized, I think, is because a lot of the anti-white racial aggression is coming from white people.
Hmm.
And that really throws people off. It's much harder. They kind of feel like, well, can I even call that anti-white racial aggression if it's coming from white people? The answer is yes. The
Hmm.
answer is yes. You can, because it is. And I think, but it is psychologically confusing for people to be able to say, I'm being racially abused for being white by a white lady at work.
Hmm.
And I've actually don't know that I've ever experienced it from a white man. It's always a white woman. I don't know, maybe I'm
I have
okay, okay.
it was the
There clearly
chancellor
are.
of my graduate school who called me
Okay,
a white
okay.
supremacist for
Okay.
objecting
Who's
to
white?
this
Okay.
stuff. Yeah.
There's clearly people like Donald Moss and other people who are
Uh,
white who do this. So it's not,
uh,
I can think of examples, but the but I wrote a different article that's yet to be published that was trying to explain the issue of white people who hate white people, which
yeah.
is such a central dynamic to understand. And that just in a nutshell, the psychological mechanism that I think is driving it is something called reaction formation.
Okay.
That's when you turn a feeling into its opposite. So a good example of this might be the classic stereotype is the guy who's gay, represses his homosexuality, and becomes an anti-gay
Hmm.
crusader.
Hmm.
But is like another example is you have a crush on somebody, but they're unavailable, so you hate them.
Hmm.
We've kind of seen some of this stuff, but usually the the reaction turning love into hate or hate into love, that has a um an odd ring to it. There are certain features that stand out when it's reaction formation that make it. So think about the woman hates this guy who she has a crush on. Okay.
Hmm.
There's a way where she's really preoccupied with this person so that she's always thinking about him. She hates him in a weird way that might reveal her true feelings. Like he thinks he's so hot. He just thinks he's it's like she'll kind of like say things that kind of reveal that she is attracted to him. Um, and the aggression can have this counterproductive feature to it as well.
Hmm.
So her resentment to him brings them closer and entangles them together and like enmeshes them. And it's not like distancing them and actually staying away from, but it's like, so there's these different
Hmm.
features of it being an odd tone, revealing your true feelings, and being counterproductive. I would say those are three really big telltale signs of reaction formation. They're all present in most white people who hate white people. Just to hit back the weird tone of it, uh, the revealing their true feelings. I mean, how many white people say showing up on time? How many of the white people who express hatred towards white people will say showing up on time is a white trait,
Hmm.
and math ability is racist to care about, or they'll just say things, or voting. If you black people can't get an ID. Shoplifting needs to be legal because black people are like, it's like they're trading in the worst anti-black stereotypes for their anti-racism. And if you really get into this literature, like there's this whole theme of whiteness being this really intoxicating drug.
Hmm.
This is like something that comes up in the literature about how
Weird.
good it feels to embrace your whiteness and how hard you have to fight against it because it feels so good. It's so weird.
That is
And
super
like,
weird.
but and what is everything they do? They push white people towards to giving up on diversity, giving up on social justice. They push people away from concern about these issues. They also engage in policies that they mostly hurt black people, getting the police out of black neighborhoods, and like uh, other kinds of actions that hurt black people. So you look at what they're doing and everything that they're doing is counterproductive. It has this bizarre tone that trades in stereotypes that are very bad towards black people, that
Hmm.
idealize whiteness in a
Hmm.
weird way. And it just has that ring. And I think it's as race intensifies
Hmm.
and it's socially unacceptable to say anything positive about white people or to confront
Mhm.
anti-white hate, it makes it more likely that people are then going to repress those feelings and develop a reaction formation. So
Mhm.
there's this potential spiral
Mhm.
where normal positive feelings about your history and culture are unacceptable. So you turn them into the opposite, and then it kind of becomes this spiral of reaction formation and demonization of white people. I think it's a it's a hypothesis, it's a
Mhm.
theory. I don't have data for it, but I think it's a very strange dynamic that is worth thinking about and studying. But I think that the presence of it really derails people from being able to confront these problematic ideologies. That they kind of see white people clearly demonizing white people and expressing so much aggression towards them, and it makes it harder to just say
Mhm.
this is this is just hateful bigotry and to respond assertively.
That's really fascinating. I'm really intrigued, and I'd like to hear more about that when your article comes out. I want to read that. I also wonder if there's some of the sort of a minority worship going on here, like uh especially in America, we have people are so uprooted from heritage. I mean, everybody is. If you've been in America
Right,
for a long time, if your family's been here for generations, then it's kind of hard to hold a sense of your lineage and whatever your cultural
right,
ancestry is. Chances are you're rather detached from it. We call ourselves Heinz 57 all the time, and people are from all kinds of places. They don't know what they are. So
mm,
white kind of loses its meaning. White is a meaningless term for people. It's not, I'm not Italian, I'm not Irish, I'm not whatever. I'm just white.
right,
And
right, right,
that's sort of that's I think in terms of culture, it puts people in sort of a vulnerable position. Like, I don't have roots. Who am I to feel anything about what I am? And then we have this educational program that comes through the schools, that comes through this DEI stuff, that just comes through media and culture in general, that uplifts the minority as somebody who really does have a story. This person, this
right,
group of people, they really do have heritage, and it was heritage that was taken from them. And who are you? You're just what even are you? You're not worth looking at
right,
as a cultural entity. You're just a consumer. But here are these people who have been greatly victimized and
right,
did have a culture that they could have been in touch with if it weren't for you. And so I think that there's an infantilizing and a like noble victimhood myth that goes along with the minority schema in the US anyway. And and this is where the virtue signal comes in. Like, if you are, what are you but a worthless consumer with no backstory. And just for your own selfishness, you take from these people who really do have something. So lay yourself down and prostrate yourself at their feet, lift them up. And this is your virtue, by laying yourself down. And what you're supposed to do is then also reach out and pull the other ones like you down so that we can all lift them up. And I kind of see
right,
this as
right,
almost a
right.
minority worship culture.
Well, I would say a couple of things. So the first
Mhm.
thing is I think that there is like basically like there is a European American culture. Um it's basically like even though it's not the majority of the country there is like an Anglo-American Protestant tradition that's modified over time that I think has all the features of culture. People are forbidden from identifying with
Mhm.
that in
Mhm.
any positive way. So it's not, I don't know that it's just like it was a passive thing that they lost touch with it. I think
Mhm.
that if you were attached to that cultural tradition, that would be seen as unacceptable. So, but I do think that I don't know that I would say it's worship. I don't know that I would use that term, but there is an idealization. And sometimes the idealization gets really wonky and weird where, they're geniuses, they're brilliant heroes, and I do think there is this like, uh very, very jarring idealization
Hmm.
of certain cultures that is not accurate and not realistic and
Hmm.
not really rooted in what those experiences actually are.
Hmm.
Like they're complex, there's positive and negative trends and dynamics, and it's not one simple thing, and there's complexity, and that's washed out in this uh desire to paint these groups. It's like, and the inability to talk about anything negative in the culture or history of a group
Hmm.
is you're not going to understand it. Like you're just not going to understand it because it's not accurate.
Hmm.
And there's this inability to kind of acknowledge any of that. So they get very grandiosely idealized. But I think like the solution is to the extent we're even going to think about people in these terms, um, which again was kind of like foisted on us constantly in this culture, and why we need to respond to it is because we're just constantly bombarded with it. Um, but to the extent that we are, we have to develop accurate, nuanced, integrated sense of what these cultural entities are in terms of a mix of positive and negative traits and dynamics that change over time
Hmm.
and vary. And if you don't have a picture that looks like that, it's not accurate. So you need to be able to talk about things like I think the European American tradition has a lot of insight and value and beauty, and if you're not seeing that, you're not understanding it. And there's other groups that also have that, and they've got problems too, and every group has that, and if you're not talking about it in that way, you're distorting.
Hmm.
And so just to have a more sober, realistic impression about like, the group that has more power, they tend to do more bad stuff and they tend to have more achievements.
Hmm.
That's true. Any group anywhere that has more power, that's probably true of them.
Hmm.
So, and the group that has less power has fewer contributions, but they have fewer blemishes possibly. So it's just, but there's just no reality framing of it. I know we're running out of time. We need to wrap up. Maybe we can pick up with this because I do have four other problems with DEI trainings and
Oh,
we could maybe
great.
go, but those are the big two were the ones that I talked about. So maybe we could have a part two another time.
There are so many problems with DEI trainings.
Yeah,
We could do 4 parts on
four
this, I
parts. Yeah,
think.
exactly.
Yeah, I would also love to talk to you sometime about the European American culture and what has led to the undermining of that as a valid construct in our sort of social landscape right now. So maybe if you're interested in ever talking about that, I'd love that.
Well, I'll just say one thing that comes to mind immediately, which is the way that people will kind of like identify with like a particular state or something where it's like, oh, I'm a Wisconsin or
Yeah,
something.
yeah.
And it's like, I'm a Wisconsinian or I don't know what they're called. But it's like, okay, there's this, but they would never just identify as like European American. And it's like, is your culture really that different from Minnesota? Like, I'm sure it is. There's probably a difference, but I don't know. But it's like they're clearly reaching for an identity, and there's an obvious thing that they're not allowed to identify with, and then there's these other kind of pseudo things
Mm.
that they grasp onto because they're maybe socially acceptable to have. So.
Yeah, there's so much there. I'm so interested in talking with you about that. Maybe we can chew on it at
Okay.
some future point. Well,
Sounds
thank
good.
you so much for this conversation and for just coming right out. And I really appreciate just the strong statement that the reason why these trainings are wrong is essentially because they are so hostile, hateful, and aggressive. Not all the other sort of soft sell reasons we want to give it. Just being able to put
Yeah.
just draw highlight that, underscore that this is the central problem.
And I do think the all or nothing framing of it is a good way to show why that aggression is distorted and destructive because they don't say positive things about white people. They don't say negative things about other groups. It is this all or nothing framing that's behind the aggression. That's a very effective way to highlight that these are obviously distorted and obviously dysfunctional. So I think those two go hand in hand and are a more precise way of responding it than the other critiques, which are mostly valid, but I think not quite getting at the heart of the issue.
Excellent. I really look forward to part 2 of this discussion. And
Okay, great. Thanks,
thanks,
Leslie.
Andrew.